So in terms of the book, it was actually published in German first, and it's now been out of print 3 times, and it's on Der Spiegel's bestseller list. So that's something we find very encouraging. So the English version has just been out, and I think it's already out of print. So we're trying to get more copies. But to the substance. How do you move really beyond GDP to well-being economics? That's our overall aim. And our main finding so far is that by looking at these things, how they connect, we find that the speed of action on planetary boundaries, whether it's climate or biodiversity, is a function of the speed of action on inequality and poverty. How this is interlinked, we will explore pretty briefly. But the idea is that just doing an energy transformation or doing a food transformation or working on the empowerment of women or doing something on poverty, if one proceeds and the others are not aligned, then it will be delayed. But also that if you do succeed on one or two of the others, this also influences the others in causal long-term relationships. So how have we been doing this and why have we been doing it? Before I give a quick dive into the model, you could say, I heard you say, Andrea, how many models you're already working on. And we also ask ourselves that question, why do we need yet another model? And part of the inspiration is from the tradition where we see that the current integrated assessment models available in the world are very strong on the relationship between economy, energy, emissions, and the climate system. However, the social dynamics aren't really well integrated, at least as well. So this article in Nature saying climate policy models need to get real about people. Here's how. They gave a good argument, but nothing quantitative. So in terms of how the different costs accrue to different groups, how this influences public opinion, particularly in terms of well-being and the correlation from well-being to social trust, and finally the confidence in political institutions or the lack of it, how this influences the economy back. These are things that we have been explicit about, and we can go to some level of detail into that today. We also know that since the finance crisis in 2009, there's been several ongoing attempts to rebuild macroeconomic theory. So, for instance, in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, there was a number of articles that looked in how the one equilibrium type of models don't really capture the dynamics. So now they are speaking about having multiple equilibria models in the macroeconomic tradition. We, however, go a different route. So in a way, you could call our model disequilibrium models, because we find the assumption of equilibrium not very useful, and hence we prefer causal system dynamics modeling rather than the optimization approach where that main of IAMs have been using. So the scope of this model is that we have broken down the global economy into 10 different regions with different productive assets. Actually, we have 2 versions of the models. One does the whole global economy as an entity, and the other is an aggregate where we have the 10 major economic regions where all the world's countries belong to one region or the other. As of course the development in Africa is very different from the one in China, which is very different from the US one. Then we use the framework from Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Centre group that David is belonging to, 9 planetary boundaries, and we also have a social module, which I will spend the most of my time on before I hand over to David to explain what's novel in terms of the Earth4All's modeling of the societal responses to whether it is natural world shocks or economic shocks. So that's the scope. The main sectors in the model, both the global and the regional version, is that we have endogenous population sector, where one novelty is that we don't just assume the UN standard population forecasts. We rather do an in-depth exploration of the causal drivers of population, particularly education, health services, and contraception levels. So that's an example of a novelty in this sector. We have all the standard economics, such as the output of the private sector feeding into GDP, but we also have an explicit public sector, which makes it possible for us to model the assumptions of emissions. So if we, partly inspired by Mariana Mazzucato and others, run a missions-oriented economic development, how could this look like? What economic implications would it have? We do have a climate module, of course, the food and land use models, energy use. So this is the structure, the overall structure of the model. Within each of these, there may be 80 to 100 variables. So the model in itself is like 800 variables on the global level. Then we have these 5 main actions, so where you can pull levers. How quickly do you address inequality? For instance, what's the level of transfers to households? How much of the tax should the owners pay versus the workers? So how much of the tax goes to the top 10%? Versus if you address taxation at a flat level. We also look at how you can stimulate more rapid growth in low-income countries. So there are a number of levers within each of these 5 main action areas that we call turnarounds. And we call them turnarounds because you have to break with the conventional or the main trends over the last 4 decades. The model runs from 1980, which means that we replicate causally the main developments in the main variable time series over the 4 decades. And then that makes it possible to do experiments on the next 4 to 8 decades. Main causal loops in the model. This is what is driving the model, but also some of the novelties. I can't go through all the detail here, but we can return to this if you have questions. I just want to point out 3 novelties and how we model them. The first is that we have material flows in the model, not just monetary flows. So the crops use, the fertilizer use, the land area use, all these physical variables exist in the food module. Similarly, the amount of coal, oil and gas and nuclear is also included in the energy sector. So this is ecological economics in the sense that we include material flows in addition to the monetary flows. So that's one novelty. Another novelty is that we split the public sector investment from the private sector investment. And this is what I mentioned makes it possible to model mission-oriented politics. We also have learning curves in terms of if there are increasing attention to the speed of greening. So we call that the rate of technological advance in the economy on specific sectors, not just the general total factor productivity, but you can go in and have specific improvements in certain areas that can increase the green fraction, whether it's in food or in energy, which could bring down emissions, which would bring down environmental damage, and over time improve well-being. So if there is more destruction, well-being goes down. If there is more social tension, well-being goes down. And otherwise, with increasing public spending and disposable incomes, we can have increases in well-being. So there's a social dynamic here. There is a physical material flows dynamic here, and there is a missions-oriented approach in here, which this model then makes possible. But if we let everything just be as it has been over the last 4 decades and replicate the main trajectory of the world, and we run this model then another 4 to 8 decades into the future, well, then we get a scenario which we call the too little, too late scenario. And the main findings from this scenario is that we have here one curve for each of the 6 main trends. Population peaks at 9 billion in 2050 and starts a slow decline to 7 billion. So here we are clearly on the low end of the UN population forecast. Social tensions rise, however, all the way to 2050. So if somebody finds the level of social tensions high today, just wait another 20, 30 years where we have this trend going on. And so also that means one of the policy or main messages from the book and the project is that we'll probably see social breakdowns before we see a total breakdown of, let's say, runaway climate change or dramatic other tipping points in the global life-supporting Earth systems. Third, global warming crashes through the 2-degree boundaries at some point in the 2050s and heads to about 2.5 degrees at the end of the century. Inequality is also a main driver of social tensions, and declining well-being keeps increasing to around 2060. Poverty is eradicated by 2050. We define that as being below $4 per day or $15,000 per person per year. And as a function of all these, our average well-being index keeps declining until 2060 and then oscillates in term with the business cycles. And why do these curves wiggle? Well, it is because we have a disequilibrium model where we assume that the economy will still go through booms and busts approximately every 10 years. Now, the well-being index is a new concept. So what do we mean with well-being and how can we quantify it? My background is both as a psychologist and an economist, and of course I've been deeply into the subjective well-being research. You can of course ask people on a number of items on surveys, as Daniel Kahneman tradition have done. How is your average life satisfaction for the time being? And you can get answers that are scientifically valid and reliable and interesting, but of course you can't do that in the future. So how can we know something about future well-being? And in order to create up objective well-being measure, we have quantified what we call the average well-being, and we are collaborating with the Well-being Economy Alliance and the Well-being Government, and they have put up the 5 main dimensions of well-being, which is dignity, nature, connection, fairness, and participation. This is their definition of dignity. Fundamental needs must be met. Nature, people safe and healthy in their communities. Connection, institutions focused on delivering shared well-being. Fairness, a fair distribution of the commons and wealth. Participation, citizens active, engaged in economy and communities. In our model system, we have these variables which come close. So this is our approximation to the intended 5 dimensions of well-being here. So we use the worker disposable income per person after tax. We use the public spending per person, so how much health services, how much education, how much institution building, capacity building, etc. Then the level of inequality we define as the owner disposable income divided by worker disposable incomes. So if you will, the top 10% divided by the bottom 50% approximated, so a version of the PALMA index. Then we have the observed global warming and the perceived progress. So this relates to the question from surveys. If you ask people, is our nation on the right track or the wrong track? So that's a very important indicator of the level of institutional trust in society. So these 5, when we weight them, we give half weight to the 2 first economic ones, then inequality, global warming, and perceived progress get equal weighting. So 25%, 25, 25, and 25. That's the current weighting. But of course, what is the correct weighting of a future well-being index? And this is something we very much want to discuss with other people. And if you have feedback on this, we would love to have it, and we can of course generate many versions of the well-being index, but this is our starting point. So just a very quick overview then. What do we see as novelties in the Earth4All model, where we make some contributions? And I will not have the time now to go into any depth there, but I want to mention that we do model inequalities in a relatively new way. We include the main planetary boundaries. We have a public sector that is explicitly an active public sector. We have the debt and the money supply, including central bank rates, interest rates, and its effects on the business cycles. We have both participation rates and unemployment cycle. We have an endogenous population dynamics sector, as I mentioned, and then we have this well-being index that I just mentioned. What I would like to focus on in the rest, my remaining few minutes, is the social dynamics we have in the model. If you remember this spaghetti here, what is actually the dynamic here between the trust, social tension, and well-being, and how it influences public policy action. So to simplify this, I've made a very short core description of the core feedback loop, which is that if inequality rises, then over time, this leads to a decline in social trust. And this is based on a number of studies and pretty clear correlations over time in many of the world countries. And I can take you through that data foundation if you're interested a bit later. Then if social trust goes down, then this brings also down the speed of public action, or how much government are able to coordinate, whether it comes to inequality or energy or food transformations. So if the speed of public action and the policy space and the capacity for coordination goes down, then inequality may get worse. So that's why there's a minus there. So with less public action, inequality will get worse. With worsening inequality, social trust goes down. Social trust goes down, which even further hampers the capacity of the public to deal with it. So this is a vicious cycle that we have seen in operation in a number of countries over the last 20, 40 years. This also influences the food and the energy turnaround in the sense that if the public action goes down, then the capacity to both implement and accelerate the renewable energy transition, energy efficiency, etc., goes down. And the same thing when it comes to regenerative agriculture and the overuse of fertilizer, etc. Further, if the energy turnaround is implemented in the wrong way, so there is regressive effects hitting the poorest hardest, then this will worsen inequality, and that will bring down social trust. So in a way, you have the yellow vests, or what happened in France as a part of our dynamic here. So what can be done about this? We have 5 global turnarounds, and if we address poverty, inequality, empowerment, food, and energy, we have 3 main variables within each, according to a more, let's say, a current paradigm, then up to a very much more ambitious paradigm-breaking policy, like universal basic dividend, abundant renewables, and changing of diets. Then the higher up you go on these turnarounds, hopefully the more effect. And then to round up, if we do all of these 5, how far can we get? And we get call this scenario for the giant leap. And this is our other main scenario, where if we do food turnaround, energy turnaround, address poverty, inequality, and empowerment, particularly of women, then we see that population peaks at 9 billion in 2050s, which is very similar to the one Too Little Too Late, but it declines a little bit faster to the end of the century. Social tensions start to decline from around 2025. Doesn't go very far down, but we keep it at least not from rising. Global warming stays below 2 degrees. Inequality starts to decline and stabilizes. No, it just has, sorry, has a long-term declining trend, and poverty is eradicated by around 2045, which is almost, yeah, at least one generation earlier, more than one generation earlier than it was in Too Little Too Late, and then that the average well-being improves throughout the century. So this is the average well-being index. So this is the scenario we think the world would prefer, at least what we call most of the world.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so I have some complementary comments, I think, to Per Espen's introduction. I will present a bit on the historical numbers on the limits of growth study that we also are referring to in the book, that many of you are probably aware of. And then I will present some guidelines that we used for developing the Earth4All model. Before going to the model, and show some population trends on the disaggregated regional levels. So as many of you know, this is also the 50 years since the Limits to Growth study from 1972, a study that has been through a lot of criticism, a lot of reevaluation, etc. And one of these were published almost a year ago by our colleague Gaia Harrington. So these are the four of the 11 or 10 scenarios in the original study of limits to growth. They run their model from 1900 to 2100. It was a very aggregated model at the time of when it was written. We did not have the same kind of computational capacity in order to have a bigger model, but the relationships are still very valid today. And in her study, Gaia was looking at these four scenarios. We had the standard run that has sometimes referred to as the business as usual scenario in the limits of growth, the BAU2 with the double amount of resources. Then we have the CT, the comprehensive technology, that assumes a lot of technological development, double than the business usual run. And then they also presented a sustainable world scenario, which was the only scenario that went into an equilibrium. So if in her study, Gaia is following these trends from the 1900s, and you see here the empirical data is in purple, and this is the population numbers in the four different scenarios I just presented. So here we see that population has grown very much in line with the output from the World 3 model, the limits of growth model. We see a similar development when it comes to industrial output per person, or as in the original study, and also when we look at well-being using the Human Wellbeing Index, we see a very much similar picture. And I was discussing these numbers with Dennis Meadows, the head modeler back then, some days ago, and arguing that there is a new planetary reality. So this is something that the study that was done in 1972, in a way, had an easier world to model, because we had not yet entered the Anthropocene epoch. The Anthropocene epoch that can be shown here in the great acceleration graphs, where we have the socioeconomic trends in red and the mirrored Earth system trends in blue. We've moved into the Anthropocene, and this means a lot of uncertainties about the future. So this makes it more difficult to do very long-term prediction or forecast or scenario of how the world will develop. The rest of my presentation is based on a technical note that was also shared in for this meeting, in the meeting invite. And the Earth4All model, we call it Earth4All because there was an Earth 1, which is the assumptions made in the 2052 book by Randers. And then this model was developed also for China, for example. And then we had a 2018 report with that Per Espen was also a leading part of, and with Jürgen Randers and Ivar Rockström, and then now the Earth4All model. So the Earth4All model is different to the earlier ones, as it is an endogenous model. That is, it's a full system dynamics model compared to the earlier Earth models. And one thing that we really looked into when developing this model was if we can take some shortcuts, not to have a huge model, but a still comprehensible model. And we were looking at, so here are some examples of correlations between GDP per person and different SDG outcomes. So here you see SDG 1 to 7, and for some of the regions that we used for the 2018 study, United States, other rich countries, China, and so on. And we see very similar patterns here. So this is something that we can use in the modeling, but being aware of that these patterns are correlational and not necessarily causational. So as this is a system dynamics model, it's a causal descriptive model. So we're using these in order to see, these give a good hint of that when we develop the model, it should have similar relationship between these, but with also backed up by a causal hypothesis and causal relations that are explicitly ingrained in the model. But for the Earth4All, we use slightly different regions. So here you see some of the regions are countries. We had, as I mentioned before, as for the 2018 study, United States and China as their own regions. We had South Asia in yellow here, which is absolutely biggest population-wise. We had Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe in light green, and the region we called Pacific in dark green, which is the non-Europe OECD countries. So just as I mentioned, these guidelines that we also present quite thoroughly in the technical note, here's an example of that. Birth rate declines with rising incomes. We see all the regions here with the different colors. We see the birth rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have GDP per person. So we have a very clear relationship here. But as Per Espen was almost referring to here, is that the relationship does not go through income necessarily, but education and health. So we have education and health incomes, health outcomes that give rise to lower birth rates. When a population is educated and have access to healthcare in the form of family planning, assets, etc., we see a declining birth rate. But this is more explicitly in with causal assumptions in the model, which I will show you in a couple of minutes. Another relationship that is very important for the model is the capital labor ratio that is increasing with rising incomes. That for richer regions, there's more capital per worker. We also have this with energy use per person, which is increasing with rising incomes. But we also see a saturation here, where really rich regions and rich countries are not using much more energy than countries that are behind, basically, when it comes to incomes. So that, together with assumptions about how the future looks, make the model do not assume that energy use will skyrocket, basically. So here, then, as a consequence, we see CO2 emissions per person is increasing with rising incomes, but is reduced by steady technical advance. So you can see here for some of the regions of the world, since 1980, the CO2 emission per person has actually declined slightly. In the Stella version of the model that I have been working on, and that we are also sharing openly online now, the model is looking like this. So we have the different sectors that you can zoom into, and each red arrow here is representing that there are causal relationships between the different parts of the model. So if we look at the population model, for example, we see here an aging chain. So from the left, we have here our birth and inflow. We have a stock of the population between 0 and 20. And when they pass 20, they move into this stock. And the stock 20 to 40 is very important, because that's the stock that we are assuming parent in the parental ages. So the size of this stock is, of course, very important when making projections about future populations, because depending on the size of this stock and the fertility rate, we will have a birth rate. And then if we see here observed fertility is depending on the desired number of children, which is a consequence of a delayed effect on GDP per person, basically the education and health outcomes of the parental cohort. And then the age 40 to 60, so age 20 to pension age are the workforce in the model. So that size is very important in deciding the size of the production of a region. And then we have the people on pension age. And the total population is, of course, an aggregate of these. So some of you, I assume, have been working with system dynamics model and understand this reasoning. So this is actually how the model looks like. And if you click on any of the variables, you will see the equation behind it. And this, again, we are sharing on the project website. And on the right here, we see the life expectancy, which is also, of course, depending on health outcomes. So it's a delayed effect of GDP per person. In this version, you also see that the stocks are not only stocks, but actually arrayed into different regions. So we have a regional model that is being developed, and we have one version that we have been able to simulate. And just looking at the world population as a sum of the different regions in this early developed version of the regional model, we can see the future population developing something like this. We have, as I mentioned, the South Asia as the absolutely biggest region, then China and Sub-Saharan Africa as a the fastest growing region, and then you see the rest of the world. I think Per Espen went into the average well-being index quite thoroughly, but I also saw a question in the chat. So here we see the worker disposable income. So I just wanted to mention the equations here, which is of course the production multiplied by the worker share of this. And then we have also transfers to workers. And then we divide this by the worker force to get the worker disposable incomes. And everything in the model is measured in 2017 purchasing power parity adjusted dollars. Public spending per person is also in the well-being index. Inequality, as Per Espen mentioned, is quite close to the Palmer ratio. It's the owner's income after tax divided by the worker income after tax. Environmental damage, and here we use a proxy of observed global warming. And then again, the perceived progress that Per Espen explained quite thoroughly. So I saw there was a question about the OECD well-being index, and yes, we've been looking at those. They are using many. They are enabling a weighting, so you can weight these differently. That's something we could also do with this model. One limitation of what I mean, one kind of when developing this kind of model, we also need to make it understandable and not too comprehensive. So we could of course add different ingredients of this index, but that would also make the model bigger, and we would need more causal hypothesis about why we see certain types of relationships and so on and so forth. So one aggregate representation of the model is also this here, where you see we have the production and consumption, which is the capitals building up physical capital, production capital. So these are reinforcing loops that give rise to growing economies, but also increasing material throughputs and gives pressures of planetary boundaries. So these pressures, of some of them are included in the model, giving rise to lower productivity of lands, for example, etc., when there is bigger pressures on the planetary boundaries. Per Espen also showed the scenarios, and I want to park a bit on the juggler cycle, this 10-year cycle. That is something that is quite novel and endogenous to the model. We also have a shorter term financial cycle of 4 years, which gives rise to the interest rate of the model. But you see and inflation, but you see here the 10-year cycle, which we really find in data on some of the regions from Latin America, for example. You can really see this 10-year. And if you think about Europe and other regions, there was the financial crisis in the 2008, and before that there was one around 2000, and now we're moving into one. So endogenously, the model generates these cycles depending on relationship with unemployment and the worker share of income.